Hello, and thank you for joining us for this second segment with Reverend Elder Don Eastman and Reverend Elder Jim Mitulski. We are reflecting on ministry and activism in the early battle against AIDS through the lens of the Metropolitan community churches. We do want to encourage you to go back and watch segment one, where both Elder Eastman and Elder Mitulski responded to the questions of when and where was your first awareness of AIDS, and how did you get involved in ministry and activism in response to AIDS? And in this segment, is going to be responding to two more questions for us. And the first question is what was the impact of AIDS on you and your congregation, communities, in or social circles? Let me read that again. What was the impact of AIDS on you and your congregation, communities, in or social circles? And Don, we start off with you again.
Well, for me, fear and grief were our constant companions. And the constant fear, I happen to be one of those, and I have no idea why I never became HIV positive. Uh, because it was just sheer luck. I can't even explain it.
Mm,
But I can say this. Um, there was a dark cloud that was always over me.
mhm.
And, the clouds would come and go. You might have a little sunshine now and then, but it was constant, a constant fear. And and there would be episodes of thinking, oh, this is it. Uh, for my experience, I remember once, this was in 1985, and um, I had been I started to have a redness in my mouth, and it wouldn't go away. I went to my dentist, and she tried different things, and I couldn't. It just nothing would help it, and so finally she said, "Okay, I'm going to send you to a oral surgeon and have a biopsy." And I went to the oral surgeon, and he looked at it and he said, "Yeah," he said, I can do a biopsy." He said, "But a biopsy is going to be uncomfortable." And he said, "I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to send you to an oral pathologist at the Baylor University Dental School." And so he called and sent me over, and I went over to the Baylor University, and the doctor came in and looked at it, and then he he said, gee, I've never seen that before."
Mm.
And he said, let me get a scraping. And he got a tongue depressor and did a scraping. He went back and he came back and he said, "Oh yeah, that's thrush." Well, that's, I thought
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is it. That's what we lived with. And I was just, it was Monday. It was my day off. I freaked out. I went to a local daytime bar, drank two screwdrivers, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And I thought, oh, I've got to do this. I've got to do that. By the way, let me tell you Troy Perry's story around this too. Uh, it's a great one. Anyway, the that I went to Baylor University. The doctor said it's thrush. My physician was Jim Wheeler, who was a gay man who was an oncologist and a hematologist at Baylor University. And he decided to give up oncology because he was just tired of dealing with patients that were dying all the time. He thought he'd have a nice practice among gay men in Oak Lawn in Dallas. And that was a couple years before AIDS hit. But I called, so I went back and I called Jim Wheeler and I said, "This is it. I've got AIDS." And I told him, I said, I've got AIDS. I know it's AIDS. I went to the Baylor University oral pathologist, and he said it's thrush. And I, I said, "So I'm sure it's AIDS. What should I do?" And he said, "God damn it, stop thinking about it like that. He said, it's not AIDS. He said, of course you have thrush. You've been on antibiotics for 3 months. And that's what happens with antibiotics. He said, your dentist should know better. And that the other pathologist should know better. And so that, then I had to, but he also at the same time advised me against getting the HIV test when that was available because he said there's no medicine for it and they're still talking about quarantine here.
Mhm.
So he said there's nothing you can do about it if you do know you're positive. And so I went another couple of years without, and I moved to California and I went to Troy Perry's doctor at first. He was Dr. Joel Wiseman, who was well known in HIV/AIDS circles. He that first report on pneumocystis pneumonia that came out of Los Angeles. He was one of the doctors filing that report with the CDC, and uh, and so in '87 he convinced me. He said, Don, you need to go ahead and get the HIV test, and I got it. And a few days later, he called me. I was home at my apartment, and he told me the test was negative, and I just lost it.
Mm.
And I laid down on the bed just heaving and crying, for about 10 minutes. It was just total release of that fear. And that was characteristic. The other I remember Troy's experience with the this was when Jerry Ann Harvey was the pastor of MCCLA. And if you knew Jerry Ann and you knew Troy, both of them were given to drama. And if you put them together, it was drama squared. And and so Troy was eating breakfast one morning and he looks down at his feet and there's purple spots on his ankle, on his feet, and on his feet. And he said, "Oh my God, I've got AIDS. That's it. That's Kaposi sarcoma, Kaposi sarcoma." And I he's and he called Jerry Ann she was the pastor of the mother church. He said, "Jerry, this is it. I've got Kaposi sarcoma, this purple spots on my foot." And and the uh, she said, "Well, okay." She said, and they began to talk about what they were going to do, how they were going to tell the church. And he said, I'm going to go to see Joel Wiseman, but I'm not going to go until after his office is closed because people will recognize me there." And he was doing all this planning, and they're going in. And he said they got to there, and Jerry's telling him what he has to do, and you can just imagine the drama that's emerging here. And so they go to Dr. Wiseman's office, and he said, I know I've got AIDS now. I've got Kaposi sarcoma on my foot." And he said, "Well, let me examine it." And he looked at it. He said, "Well," and Troy said, "I know I'm going to die, and I'm prepared for that." And he's going all through this. And he said, "Well, Troy, maybe you will die." But he said, "If you do, you're going to be my first case of terminal athlete's foot." And that was just one of our many stories. But I do know that as a pastor, the impact on our congregation was that we lost hundreds of people. We lost hundreds of our church members to AIDS by the time the medications were discovered, the cocktail medications in '96, that era, when the reversal of all the rapid deaths happened. People still died of AIDS, but it was a whole different world all of a sudden, and and the and but here's the other impact, and I want this not to be lost. But even during those years that we had all those hundreds of AIDS cases, uh, our church continued to grow.
Mm.
because people were turning to us because of AIDS, not away.
Mm.
And uh, I always remember I was at a AIDS conference in Mexico at the late 1980s. I can't remember if it was in Mexico, but our pastor from Guadalajara was at the conference, and he said, "Someday AIDS will be nothing but a bad memory. The good memory will be what we did about it."
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's a good reflection down memory lane, Don. That's like you just can't when you live it that close and up front. And I like the fact that your couch, even though all this was happening, the church was still growing because it was needed at the time. It was beyond one of for such a time as this, and your presence in that community and the church made a major difference in lives. So, yeah. So, Jim, what was the impact of AIDS on you and your congregation, communities, and our social circles?
So I was blessed really to serve two congregations during the most acute periods, MCC New York in Greenwich Village and MCC San Francisco in the Castro district, the gay area of San Francisco, as if the whole city weren't gay. Uh, and I would say that AIDS defined really our experience of ministry in that 20-year period. I'm going to say early 80s through the end of 90s.
Mm.
Uh, and it was true in my personal life. It was true in my personal life as a gay man. It was true in the church and my social circles. And I was living in two zip codes and working in two zip codes that were more affected by HIV than most places per capita. So the whole world, it seemed like, had AIDS. And it is true that a lot of people that we knew in San Francisco, in the zip code that I worked in, nearly 20,000 people died of AIDS over a multi-year period. And it was a neighborhood. So that's a lot of people in a relatively contained area. We really did feel like we all knew each other. It was a small town in a sense. If you imagine a town of 30 or 40,000 people and half of the people being dying of AIDS, and at least 50% of the people there being infected with it. So it was pervasive, really, from the very beginning. And it wasn't just something that I lived with, but all of us lived with. And that became, I think, the creative tension. The kind of ministry that we innovated in the metropolitan community churches is because of the intensity, in part, that we were experiencing. It wasn't ministry to people with HIV and AIDS, it was ministry with.
Mhm.
And that's a big difference. I think there were a lot of, genuinely sympathetic churches and religious groups that would feel sorry for people with AIDS because they were experiencing terrible physical infirmity as well as social stigma. But it's only because they could look at them and do ministry to them, if you will.
Mhm.
When it came to affirming them, celebrating them as, in the case of gay men, sexually active, vibrant people making important life choices and living counterculturally, churches were not willing to do that.
Mhm.
We had a phrase at MCC San Francisco because there was a church nearby that did a lot of funerals. That was a good church, Catholic church, and I have respect for it. But they would have funerals for the person who had just died of AIDS. And then people would come to MCC for a real celebration of life, where that person's actual life story was celebrated.
Mhm.
And our saying was, because we did as many weddings as we did funerals. And I would say in that context, this is in the 80s and 90s, before these ceremonies had any legal status. And we didn't even care. We didn't want, I could almost go this far. Not only could we not imagine legal gay marriage, it wasn't particularly a value. Uh, uh, we celebrated the marriages because we loved each other and it had meaning in and of itself, apart from whatever legal status it would have. So doing all these weddings was as much AIDS ministry as doing the funerals. And we used to say about this church on the next street, if you won't marry us, you can't bury us.
Mm.
That's because I learned in this period that if a church or a group can't deal with sexuality and homosexuality, then they can't really do meaningful and authentic AIDS ministry. I'm not saying that they didn't do important work, but this is who we were, who we are. not something that we were removed from. And that absolute sense of identification, I think, made our ministry so strong and so powerful. It was we tried not to divide the world, even though the culture was trying to divide us in this way, into a world of HIV negative and HIV positive.
Mm.
We also tried not to divide the world, even though we had great respect in MCC for feminism and lesbian separatism, because in a sense, MCC was a gay church. We were a separatist church. We understood that sometimes you have to stand apart in order to figure out who you are and find your strength, right? But during AIDS, we were not women versus men. We were women and men together, lesbians and gay men together. That was my experience of AIDS and how it affected people. It brought us together in a very powerful and sometimes countercultural way, in a way that modeled something for the communities as well, apart from what we were doing around AIDS. Here's how it impacted us. I feel like I just heard myself being interviewed from that period where I used a phrase called an AIDS consciousness.
Mm.
Uh, I lived in a state of, and we all did, of AIDS awareness, AIDS consciousness. We saw everything through the lens of what was happening with AIDS. And I know I said this many times. If a church isn't dealing with what's happening to people with HIV and AIDS right now, then they're not being faithful to the gospel. And just as I felt that was true around marriage equality, that if a church can't stand with us in our love for each other and celebrate that, then they're not being faithful to the gospel. I don't know what they're doing on Sunday mornings, but it isn't ministry. And that sounds a little harsh, 30 years later, but that was our consciousness. Our world was AIDS. I was a 27-year-old minister conducting funerals and pastoral visits for people my age and older and some younger. Here's another way it affected us. It radicalized us. There was no way to be apolitical if you were affected by HIV and AIDS. And I'll give an example from 1995. There was a woman who came to our church named Phyllis Nelson. She and her husband, Phil Nelson, started coming. And we thought they were a sympathetic straight couple. We loved them. We celebrated them. Oh, how cool is this? And then it turns out that Phil was gay, and they were trying to find a place where they could be as a family, as a gay and straight couple, right? And they had a son named Glenn, who as it turns out, had HIV, and he had a partner named Robert. So here's what happened. And Phyllis became the vice president of the board of directors, working alongside me. First, Glenn became ill, and we were present to him for that. And then Robert became ill. We were present to him. I did their wedding. And then in a series of months afterwards, I did first Glenn's funeral and Robert's funeral. And I remember after that last funeral for Robert, Phyllis and I, the mother and the mother-in-law of the two guys, were standing outside watching the sunset. And we said, this is the saddest day of our lives, but we're not going to let it defeat us.
Mm.
Within a year, the city approached me in 1995, Tom Amiano, supervisor, and Mitch Katz, medical director, about whether or not I would distribute medical marijuana from church, which was illegal at that time and still is illegal in some places. And recreational wasn't even on the table, right? But we knew that marijuana made a difference for people's comfort and also gave them appetite when they were taking toxic medications that made it difficult for them to eat. So they asked me to do it because they said the government will never arrest you, though they couldn't guarantee that. But I called up Phyllis, the vice president of the board, and I said, the city has asked me to do this. They said they'll protect me from local police, but they can't protect us from federal prosecution, so the government decided to prosecute. And she said, of course you're going to do this, and I'm going to stand right next to you and do it with you. The next Sunday in church or after church, but the media made it look like we did it at communion. And the truth is, we'd had it. It was after the service was over, but I was standing in front of the altar and the elements were still there. And she stood next to me, and we handed out marijuana, and we did that for several months for free. People supplied us with it because it made a difference in people's lives. It made them feel better. Mm-hmm. And what she said to me was, if the governor could spend a whole morning trying to get his son to eat a half a bowl of cereal, he would stand here with us and
Mm,
understand what we were doing.
mm,
That's how AIDS affected us. It pressed us to break the law, even in order to provide comfort for the people that we loved.
mm.
Uh, Great love demands great risks, and it evoked great love from us, even as it was a terrifying circumstance to be in for a very long period of time.
For our viewers, again, I'm with Reverend Elder Don Eastman, Reverend Elder Jim Mitulski, and we are reflecting on ministry and activism in the early battle against AIDS with the Metropolitan Community Churches. And we just heard them respond to the question of what was the impact of AIDS on you and your congregation, communities, and your social circle. Very impactful story. So now we're going to move to the next question, and we'll wrap up our this conversation on the question. But the next question is, name a few people who were heroes and sheros of early responders to this new AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and early 1990s. Who are some of the heroes and sheros that come to mind for you? Don.
A few hundred would be more like it. And excuse me, the I just there are a number. I guess I want to start out with the two Steves.
Mm,
First is Steve Peters, that most of us know Steve, and he recently passed away, succumbed to cancer ultimately, but um, he was very much a part of our movement and a part of my life. And how that started was in 1987. Well, 1987, our general conference was in Miami,
Mhm.
and it
Right.
was at the old Deauville Hotel, where the famous ballroom where the Beatles had done their first concert in the United States, and that was our venue. And Troy Perry opened up that conference by showing the famous video of Steve Peters with Tammy Faye Baker on PTL. Reverend Joe Crisco at the MCC in Arlington, Texas, had videotaped it and sent it to Steve, so he had the whole video. And they played the whole video of that event at the beginning of the conference, and it was just the response from all of the people gathered at General Conference, which was close to 1,000 people, was just thunderous. People were just cheering Steve, and Troy invited Steve to come up to the platform, and people were still applauding and cheering. And Troy whispered to Steve, you know, you can smile, but don't. He said, you can nod, but don't say anything. And they and the and that set the tone for the whole general conference.
mm,
That one event, and the reality was AIDS was with us full force at that point in
Yeah.
85. I mean, now it was getting really where it was. I know in Dallas that's when we were starting to do multiple funerals. I had done several funerals, and when when I would when I would get to the cemetery, I'd be in the hearse, the funeral director, and the funeral director would be finishing closing the grave, and I'd be sitting alone in the hearse, and I'd just break down and weep.
Yeah. Yeah.
These young people dying of this disease was just overwhelming. And so Steve, in 87, uh, on Friday night, I was the preacher. We had a memorial service for AIDS. I preached at the service. Jimmy Odom from our church in Dallas, who was an opera singer, beautiful tenor voice, sang the song from Les Mis, "Bring Him Home." And it was so moving. And then we had little stickers, like, the kind that "Hello, my name is," only they didn't have that on. It was just stickers. And we said to people, write somebody down the name of somebody that you know that was lost to AIDS, and come up and put them on this board, those stick. And there were just thousands, everybody, it just hundreds and hundreds of those little stickers on that board of people that we were remembering. In this was 1985,
Mm.
and that was just the tone that was set. And later that year in October, there was the March on Washington, and the elders were meeting, and the General Council was a meeting after the March on Washington, the day after, and the elders created the UFMCC AIDS Ministry, and they appointed me as the executive director and Steve as the field director, and that's how our AIDS ministry, our official AIDS ministry. Now, the reality was we were doing AIDS ministry all the time anyway. That was constant. That was a constant. But this all of a sudden was an official, and it took it to a whole new level. And it really began to empower Steve to do the things he could do best. And I just was it was such a privilege to work with Steve over those years, and just and on our fellowship website right now, MCC website, there's this timeline that Steve did. And if you haven't seen Steve's book, his memoirs, that is a must read. It is, but to me, he's one of the great leaders in the fight against AIDS, and he's up there with people like Larry Kramer in New York City, who founded the earliest gay men's health crisis. Those Steve's in that atmosphere, and it was such a privilege of a lifetime to work with Steve. The second Steve was student clergy at MCC Dallas when the first AIDS case came. Stephen Pace, his name, and he was the one at MCC Dallas most involved with AIDS ministry from our earliest days of AIDS, and it was constant and it was growing, and he was leading.
Mm.
And he went on to become ordained minister in ordained clergy. He did most of the funerals while I was in Dallas. The last week I was there, I did 5 funerals myself, and I was not doing most of them. That's how things were by 1986. And Steve went on to earn a master's in social work degree, a master of science in social work. He devoted his whole professional life to serving people with AIDS, and he is the longest serving head of an HIV/AIDS organization in the United States. He presided over more than 500 funerals, and he retired in 2023. That's the second Steve. Other people I want to really remember, especially the women. At MCC Dallas, Sylvia Hodgins, a board member, she and some other women started a thing, if I remember correctly, it was called Blood Sisters. And they were, I don't know if they're donating blood, but they were ministering with people with AIDS and leading that in our congregation and in our community. And I remember there was an article about them in the New York Times and that initiative. Sylvia Hodgins was one of our greatest leaders in MCC Dallas and later at the Cathedral of Hope. Also want to remember Joni Shelton, who was well known at general conferences. She was part of the Commission on the Laity. Joni was one of our lead deacons, and she led our lay ministers of pastoral care, which had 40 volunteers for ministry when we were just really peaking in those years of so many cases of AIDS. And also I want to remember Reverend Marge Perry, our assistant pastor, who was such a superb manager and a great preacher-teacher who was engaged in the battle. I also want to remember really a giant in our community in Dallas during the time, Howie Dare, who was the founder of the Oak Lawn Counseling Center. And that he founded it as a counseling center in 1981-82, and it went on to become the hub of our of our battle against AIDS and in supporting people living with AIDS. People's, but back then it was people when they were just diagnosed, and that was a tremendous resource. And sadly, Howie succumbed to AIDS in September 1986. And prior to he knew he was going to die. He asked me to deliver his eulogy at his funeral, which was at a Catholic church in Port Arthur, Texas, um, in September. Howie was a great hero of our faith, and I'm just so grateful for all of those heroes and sheros um, who who meant so much to so many people in those years.
Mm, great litany. Thank you, Don, for sharing that. Jim.
But Don, that was like a litany of the saints.
Yeah.
I love that. And some are living and some are no longer alive, but no less saints. Uh, and I think of who I want to lift up. I'm going to name a couple of names, and because Don talked about some of them, I may reference them, but I won't talk about them. Uh, my first important AIDS influence was Reverend Karen Ziegler, who was the senior pastor at MCC New York, where I was the associate pastor. And that was in the MCC churches had different identities. I think this is safe to say. MCC New York prided itself on its lesbian feminist identity, and particularly feminist identity. And I learned from Karen distinct feminist values around response to an aching world. What as Adrienne Rich says, I have to cast my lot with those who from time to time perversely and with no extraordinary power reconstitute the world.
Mm.
And I learned that poem from Karen, from her preaching. And by her example, she was the lesbian feminist pastor of a largely male church in Greenwich Village, New York, and helped us inaugurate our vitality as an AIDS ministry church. Uh, and so I'm forever grateful to her for her example and for that. Another colleague of mine, Reverend Ron Russell Coons, was the pastor of churches in Baton Rouge, in Sarasota, Florida, in Seattle before he died, and then became a member of MCC San Francisco in the time of his illness. He and his partner, Chuck Russell Coons, who just died this year. And Ron had HIV, had AIDS, and lived his life in public in this way. It wasn't always easy. Our churches didn't even know how to respond and didn't have the material resources either always to respond well. But his example, both as a pastor, but then through his work with the National Council of Churches, in a consultation chaired by the lesbian feminist theologian Letty Russell. He brought them to MCC San Francisco in 1989 to study AIDS. And he gave a sermon there that I'll never forget. And it's immortalized in this book, The Church with AIDS, Renewal in the Midst of Crisis, by Letty Russell.
Mm.
And Ron told his story there for representatives from nearly 40 denominational bodies. They didn't like spending time with each other on a good day because it was Protestants and Catholics and Greek Orthodox, and they didn't even recognize each other's ministries and wouldn't take communion together. And in fact, they asked us before the service not to have communion at our church service, even though it was our custom, because it was a National Council of Churches meeting and they weren't allowed to have communion with each other. So I said, Sarah, as long as I can explain to the congregation that the reason you don't want to have communion is not because you don't want to have communion with us, which is what I was afraid they would think, but because they don't want to have communion with each other. And the congregation that started off the service and they laughed, and that helped a lot to cut the tension because we had a balcony full of observers watching the people with AIDS have a church service.
Mm.
But it was a very important moment, and Ron told his story there about being a Southern Baptist minister, about losing his standing and his family as he came out, as a gay man, and then his struggles living with HIV and AIDS, and as he faced certain death. It was a beautiful, powerful spiritual testimony, and it gave hope to lots of people for his bravery and his willingness to tell the story. And it also, I think, brought MCC into the arena of significant theological reflection on what was happening. Because again, our model wasn't to send someone to a consultation who wasn't openly gay or didn't have HIV, but we sent the gay guy with AIDS to represent us and speak from personal experience. And that was a big shift, paradigm shift for them. And I still hear from people all these years later who were at some of those services. I want to lift up a person who has MCC credentialing, but is the founder of her own movement, Bishop Yvette Flunder, who is the pastor of the City of Refuge, United Church of Christ in San Francisco and in Oakland. And then later became the presiding prelate of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, which is a largely same-gender loving, largely African-American Pentecostal church that nests in the UCC. Yvette, when we first met back in the mid-'80s, was a gospel singer with the Hawkins Singers, and she started a church in San Francisco that became an equally important witness to people with HIV and AIDS. And because of that relationship, MCC San Francisco dealt not only with AIDS, but also with our own racism. And that was an important healing, an important work. You can't do AIDS work if you only care about homophobia. You have to also care about racism and sexism. I learned that from Bishop Flunder, and I'm still grateful to her for that. Just a few other names I'll lift up. An early AIDS pioneer in ministry in MCC, Reverend Lee Carlton, now retired, living in Florida, himself a person living with HIV. I was at that conference, Don, in 1987 in Miami. And Karen and I, Ziegler and I, were sitting together. And this was at a time when there was some tension between the young people and the more established people in MCC. Also, many of us who were younger were more theologically diverse, seminary educated, feminist. Some people said that our Christology wasn't as solid or as orthodox, which was true. And we said that we would vote for the first candidate for the Board of Elders who talked about AIDS during the forum. And person after person got up, lovely people, people I love, but nobody talked about AIDS because that was we were at that moment of great fear and yet deeply affected by it. And people didn't want to talk about it. So lo and behold, the 8th or 9th candidate was Reverend Lee Carlton. And that's what he started with. And he called us to action. And Karen and I looked at each other and said, okay, the last person we ever would vote for elder because of his theological differences with us was Lee Carlton. But because he was the first one, we did. We did what God said we should do. So I just want to lift up Lee for his tireless ministry in the southern part of the United States, doing AIDS and gay ministry. A couple of other people, Nancy Radcliffe, Carol West, Joe Crisco. These were names that have all been mentioned. Steve Peters, of course. Love is Greater Than AIDS is the name of his memoir, and you want to go read it. And then I think the last thing I want to lift up is that there are people whose names will never be remembered.
Right.
So many people, but the numbers doesn't diminish the value and the lack of our ability to even name them or hold all those names. The only comfort I take is that I believe that God's memory and God's heart is bigger than ours, and that those names will not be forgotten. There'll be some who have no memorial, it says in Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus. And I believe that that those names, those people, the unnamed people, are our heroes and saints as well.
I want to add one name to the mix because when I came into MCC and we had to go through intensives, and I remember it was outside of Dallas, Texas, and this intensive program is where the last step before you get ordained. And I just remember this little lady with white hair stepped up and was going to talk about sex education. And it was Reverend Irene Travis.
Yep.
And she talked to us then about the impact of HIV and AIDS. She talked to us about practicing. And her point was, if you're going to be in ministry, you need to know this. You need to know how to talk to people, how to pastor people. So I will never forget, the presence of
I know. Yeah, I know those.
many others who contribute to this movement. And I want to just for a moment, as we wrap up this discussion, I want to talk about the impact of MCC on things larger than we are today. I mean, I think of Don and your work in helping to basically create the first World's AIDS Day program, and that type of history. I want to lift up the moment, and and Don knows his lineage, and Jim probably does better than I do. But the time when MCC was having to deal with our delegates could come into the United States because of the HIV status.
Yes.
And we were at a general conference, and I remember, I think it just brought the conference to a halt because a protest had been lined up for us to take the conference to the INS office for a protest. I remember, I think it was in Calgary or Toronto, when we had the T-shirts made that said, "The body of Christ has AIDS." And those are the moments that I think about when I think about MCC and its impact on the AIDS epidemic, and how we all became activists or leaders or teachers or pastors or mentors, to, as you said, Jim, to your point, to names we don't even know, and to history, that moments that we don't even know. But what I will always believe is that MCC was on the front line. Uh,
Mhm.
we were created, as you said, Jim, earlier, I think for such a time as this. We didn't know what we didn't know, but we knew that when the call to action came, MCC responded. And so I just want to thank you two and many others as being the leaders in this movement for MCC, and this part of our timeline, and we will have other discussions about that. So my final question to you, um, what would you say to your younger self now about AIDS? What would you say to your younger self now, knowing what you know, knowing your experiences? What would you say now to your younger self about AIDS? Don, Jim, whichever one you want to go first. Don?
Well, to me, it's just thank God you're always with us.
Mm,
You know, the, um, I see it now through the lens of all that's happened, and um, it's just a deep sense of gratitude, uh, and also an awareness uh, that it's just because it's not as central to our community as it was in those years, that it was so intensely overpowering us, doesn't mean that it's not relevant to us today, because our concern has to be for the whole world.
mm,
And the back to a point that that earlier that Jim made, the just that the whole current regime that's uh, ignoring the whole world at a it's an unbelievable level of neglect and avoidance, and just the injustice is beyond description right now, and it's like we're in such a different place in this moment, and I come back to that sense that the good news that we received and that that has blessed us over these years is the gift we need to give to the future, and we can't stop now.
mm,
And that's it's and I've just had yesterday I was on a conference call with our moderator today, and my take on it, on where we're at, is I just said to her, I think for us it's time to get back to our roots and grow a whole new tree.
mm.
And uh, we're going to be needed. We are needed now more than ever. That's my take.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that reflection. And Jim, I'll pass the question back to you again. Is what would you say to your younger self, using a lens based on what you know, your experiences, and reflecting back upon all of that, and how we look at where we've come from to where we are now? What's your thoughts?
I'm going to start by saying this. There's a group of people I wanted to mention by name for the work that they did that I want to thank, and that is the people that MCC employed as AIDS ministry directors during this period. Uh, they were Steve Peters, Robert Griffin, and Joshua Love.
Mhm.
And what I loved about what we did in those days is that we lifted up real people who had HIV, who did pioneering work at great personal expense. And those, each of you, each in your way, brought hope to communities of people who didn't know how to proceed, who were paralyzed, really, by what was happening with HIV and AIDS. Your personal lives, the work that you did, were all important. And I wanted to say those names in that light. What I would say to my earlier self is, don't waste a moment on shame or guilt.
Mm.
And it's just such a distraction, and it serves no meaningful purpose. And really, and I did myself. Nobody gets through HIV or the HIV years, whether you're HIV positive or not, unscathed. It requires our best spiritual work, our best medical attention, and our best mental health work. I want to say this about myself. I struggled with substance abuse for many, many years. And to the extent that I worried about it in the light of shame or guilt, did not help me. We lived through a traumatic time, and uh, we learned through connecting with each other that that's where our strength is. So what I would say to myself is, don't worry about shame or guilt. Connect, connect, connect. Don't keep secrets. Tell people.
Mhm.
Face it with others, right? And when you do that, there's nothing that you can't overcome. And love yourself for that. I also want to say thank you, not only to my earlier self, but to all of us who lived through that together. You know, we made significant contributions. When COVID rolled around, we were able to tell the world that illness does not have the final word. We were able to show them what we learned living through one epidemic, and also some of the medical advances that took place during HIV and AIDS through research proved useful in responding to COVID. Because of that, COVID had a much shorter trajectory than HIV and AIDS did. And so I guess I want to say thank you. And I'll end with just a personal thank you to myself. You know, I've been dealing with a cancer diagnosis this year, and I threw my off my game, threw my a little bit, but I remembered you can do this. You know how to do this. God is with you in this. And my best antidote is prayer and healing. And I learned that from AIDS. I learned how to live longer and how to live better, even in the face of, you know, difficult prognoses at times, because of what we all went through together. It was not wasted. Not 1 minute was wasted. It has helped me and others, I think, embrace full life, abundant life. What did Jesus say? I came that you may have life, life in all its fullness. And I learned that not because of AIDS, but through AIDS, because of the work we did together in MCC.
Mm. Well, I want to thank you both on behalf of many, Reverend Don Eastman and Reverend Jim Mitulski. Today, for our viewers, again, we have been reflecting on ministry and activism in the early battle against HIV and AIDS from the Metropolitan Community Church's lenses. We have done this discussion in two segments. The first segment, we dealt with the question of when and where was your first awareness of AIDS? And second one was how did you get involved in ministry and or activism in response to AIDS? And in this segment, we have to address the question of what was the impact of AIDS on you and your congregation, communities, and or social circles. And then lastly, name a few people who were heroes and sheros as early responders to this new AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and early 1990s. Gentlemen, again, I want to thank you on behalf of MCC, on behalf of myself, on behalf of so many, for living your witness and your contributions to the AIDS movement. And as you have each said in your own way, MCC is still needed for such a time as this. We are needed to continue to be on the forefront to lift up Troy's still relevant, I believe, three-pronged gospel and to contribute all that we can to continue making a home for people who still have not yet heard that God loves them just as they are. And your message and your witness helps so many to do that. Thank you once again for joining us, to our viewers, and we look forward to continued discussions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.